Hey guys, tonight we step into a creaking wooden house somewhere in medieval Europe. The kind where the wind sneaks through the cracks and your breath fogs in the dim candlelight. The snow outside isn't just cold, it's a relentless, bitey reminder that comfort is a rare luxury. And honestly, you probably won't survive this without learning a few tricks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're experiencing your own cozier Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the packed earth floor, your boots crunching faintly on straw scattered for insulation. The house smells faintly of smoke, pine, and the lingering aroma of yesterday's stew. Medieval homes weren't much for aesthetics, no central heating or fluffy rugs, but they were all about survival. Every creak in the walls whispers centuries of ingenuity. You notice the thick wooden beams overhead, slightly bowed under winter weight, and you imagine the carpenters who spent weeks felling trees, stripping bark, and assembling the frame. Timber was their insulation, crude but surprisingly effective. Historians still argue whether some walls, layered with wattle and daub, actually retained warmth as well as written records suggest, or if it was more about psychological comfort than real thermal efficiency. Outside, snow presses against the walls, yet inside, there's a faint sense of enclosure, a tiny bubble of survival. You wrap your cloak tighter, realizing early on that medieval people relied heavily on these walls to shield them from frostbite. Some houses even had hidden nooks filled with dried rushes or animal hides to trap heat. A quirky little hack that modern builders might raise an eyebrow at. And of course, the hearth dominates everything. Central, smoky, indispensable. Everyone's life, or at least survival, is organized around it. From cooking to keeping livestock-derived warmth close by. You run a hand along a rough-hewn table. There's a faint waxy residue, maybe from melted candles or beeswax seals. It's the little touches like this that hint at daily life, small acts of making winter tolerable. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, life clings to warmth and routine. You imagine families huddling, exchanging stories, trying not to think about frostbite or the long stretch of nights ahead. Quirky folklore even suggested that whistling indoors could keep frost spirits away, yet comforting when the nights are long. As your eyes adjust, you spot a small soot-blackened pot over the embers. Someone just cooked a simple porridge, perhaps with barley or dried legumes, and it radiates more than heat. It radiates reassurance. The architecture itself becomes a character. Low ceilings trap warmth. Beams and posts create micro-zones of heat that allow small gatherings near the fire. Straw mats on the floor are not just for sitting there, for absorbing cold, damp, and even sound, making the house feel slightly less like a frozen tomb. You remember hearing somewhere that medieval families sometimes stuffed rushes with dried herbs for both scent and supposed healing. Affects lavender to keep sickness away, yarrow to ward off chills. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or mostly folklore, but the thought alone makes the winter seem a little friendlier. You shuffle closer to the fire, feeling the rough warmth on your face, noticing how shadows stretch and flicker across walls scarred with knots, small carvings, and soot smudges. Every object, from the wooden bowl to the ladle, is multifunctional, chosen for survival over style. The hearth itself is a constant reminder. It's heat, it's light, it's food, and for some families, it might even be a bed rolled out next to the flames. You can almost hear the muffled murmurs of conversation, the occasional cough, the scraping of boots on straw, and the clink of a pot lid's a symphony of adaptation. As you study the room, you can't help but notice the little cracks where drafts sneak in. Some houses had improvised shutters or hung blankets to block icy air, and some even coated windows with thin layers of animal fat or oiled parchment to reduce chill. Scholars still debate whether these methods genuinely kept interiors warmer, or if they mostly gave a psychological sense of protection. Either way, they show creativity born from necessity. You might smirk at the medieval equivalent of DIY insulation, but in that context, it was the difference between frostbite and survival. Above you, the roof groans with settling snow. You can almost see the family checking the beams periodically, adjusting weight distribution, ensuring no sudden collapse. It's a precarious balance, a daily reminder of the fragility of life in wooden homes, especially when storms rage for weeks. At the same time, there's comfort in routine. Firewood is chopped, water is fetched before it freezes, and meals are planned around both availability and warmth. The simple act of boiling water for porridge is also a small victory over winter's indifference. By now, your mind is adjusting to this slower pace. Unlike modern life, there's no thermostat to control, no electric blanket to rely on. You notice how medieval people used layering, both in clothing and in spatial organization, huddling together, moving from warmer zones near the hearth to cooler corners only when necessary. Even small rituals, like checking the thickness of blankets or moving a pot closer to embers, were imbued with significance. Quirky advice, like placing a bowl of water near the fire to humidify the dry winter air, or hanging onion slices to purify the home, might make you chuckle, but every little act contributed to comfort and survival. As you lean against a beam, inhaling the smoky warmth, you begin to understand the rhythm of winter in a medieval wooden house. It's not glamorous. It's not easy. It's painstakingly deliberate. Yet there's beauty in it. The tactile engagement with survival, the creativity sparked by necessity, the small comforts earned through effort. You realize that every straw, every hide, every flickering shadow tells a story of adaptation. And while your modern self might wince at the lack of insulation or the constant smoke, there's a quiet awe in imagining generations enduring, innovating, and finding warmth and safety in this fragile wooden cocoon. This is the beginning of your journey through medieval winter survival, a world where the house itself is both shelter and challenge, where warmth is won in layers of material, ritual, and human ingenuity, and where each day is a careful negotiation with frost, wind, and the dark, stretching night. You settle into the hearth's glow, feeling both gratitude and relief, and slowly, the house begins to feel alive. Not just a shell of wood and straw, but a living instrument of endurance. The hearth dominates the room like a quiet monarch, and as you inch closer, the warmth embraces you in a way that almost feels like a hug from the past. You notice how medieval families arranged everything around this central fire. The table, the benches, even sleeping areas, if the house was small enough. Fire wasn't just for cooking, it was survival. You could measure a family's winter prosperity by the size and stability of their hearth, and whether there was enough firewood stockpiled to last through the long months. Historians still argue whether some rural households truly maintained a constant fire, or if they allowed it to die overnight. To conserve precious fuel, the logs crackle, and you catch the sweet resin scent mingling with smoke. Unlike modern fireplaces, these hearths often lacked chimneys. Smoke wandered through holes in the roof or gaps in walls. It might irritate your eyes and make you cough, but it also kept mosquitoes and other pests at bay. Some fringe practices suggest people even believed smoke purified the home, warding off illness and evil spirits, a belief that seems both charming and slightly concerning when you imagine sleeping under a haze of wood smoke for hours. You shift your weight, thinking about how your ancestors probably didn't care about smoke detectors. They cared about staying alive and keeping the house bearable. You glance around at the iron pots and cauldrons hanging above the flames. Every meal is multifunctional, stews that simmer for hours, providing both sustenance and ambient heat. Even a small pot of porridge radiates warmth to nearby corners, a humble heater disguised as food. Families sometimes placed stones around or under pots to retain heat, a clever tactic to stretch warmth through the room after the fire dwindled. Oddly enough, some households sprinkled a few herbs in the cooking smoke, thinking the aroma itself could prevent colds, a quirky practice that historians still debate as to its actual effectiveness versus psychological comfort. You feel the floor beneath your feet, packed earth sprinkled with straw, carrying residual heat from the fire. Sitting near the hearth is strategic. It's a social center, a survival hub, and a warming station. Medieval people often organized their daily routines around fire cycles, first tending the blaze, then cooking, then moving near it to eat, repair clothing, or spin wool. Every activity is choreographed around the hearth's warmth. Imagine rolling out your bedroll a mere foot from the fire and feeling the radiant heat soak into blankets, slightly mitigating the night's chill. The firelight flickers on the timber beams above. The room feels alive. The shadows dance like tiny phantoms on the walls, echoing centuries of stories whispered beside similar flames. You might notice soot marks, carved initials, or even scorch patterns in ancient graffiti, marking human presence and survival strategies. Fringe accounts suggest some families even added charms to their hearths, small metal trinkets or inscriptions meant to trap warmth. And while modern historians question whether these rituals actually contributed to survival, they reveal a fascinating interplay of superstition and necessity. You follow the smoke upward, imagining how it escaped through thatched roofs and small vents, sometimes clouding the interior until the family's eyes watered. While it might seem unpleasant to you, smoke had practical uses beyond heating. It dried the roof thatch, preserved hanging meats, and even deterred insects. You notice a small shelf holding dried herbs, perhaps rosemary, sage, or juniper, ingredients for cooking, medicine, and, in some beliefs, air purification. Layering these scents with the smoky warmth created a kind of multi-purpose aromatherapy. Whether intentional or not, heat radiates not just from the fire but from the body of the house itself. Thick wooden walls and packed floors absorbed warmth, slowly releasing it throughout the night. Families might pile stones around the hearth to retain residual heat, while the central placement of the fire allowed everyone to benefit from its glow. You notice a corner where a small pot simmers slowly, likely to maintain a consistent temperature for porridge or broth. Every object, every piece of furniture, every placement of a log contributes to maximizing heat efficiency. Some historians still debate whether certain hearth designs truly optimized warmth, or if they were more symbolic of status and communal life. You feel a draft, and notice a hanging animal hide acting as a makeshift door to block icy air from sneaking in through the main entrance. These little tricks, simple as they seem, were lifelines in winter. Fringe accounts suggest that families sometimes rotated which doors or hides faced the wind, depending on seasonal weather patterns, a curious blend of observation, tradition, and superstition. You imagine a child wide-eyed, peeking through the hide to watch snow swirl outside while clutching a wool blanket around their shoulders. A ritual repeated in countless homes over generations. Looking around, you spot cooking utensils, small iron hooks, and clay pots neatly arranged. Organization was essential in maintaining warmth because clutter or misplacement meant more movement and more heat loss. The kitchen area doubles as a living area. Sometimes families slept partially in these spaces, maximizing fire proximity. Quirky accounts even mention people sleeping near open hearths with protective clay rings to prevent accident. Balancing act between safety and warmth that seems both ingenious and terrifying by modern standards. As the fire crackles, you begin to sense its rhythm, feeding it, watching embers glow, rotating logs, and allowing small sparks to leap like tiny stars. The hearth wasn't merely heat, it was life's pulse. Your ancestors relied on it for sustenance, warmth, and a sense of safety during the long, dark months. Without it, survival was precarious. With it, Life continued in small, resilient bursts of comfort. You inhaled deeply, letting the smoky, resinous scent sink in, and realized that mastering the hearth was more than domestic labor, was a profound lesson in endurance, observation, and adaptation. By now, you can almost hear whispered conversations around similar fires centuries ago, advice on tending flames, disputes over who gets the warmest spot, jokes about singed eyebrows or spilt porridge. There's humor even in hardship, a reminder that survival is both physical and psychological. That's the magic of the hearth. It offers tangible heat and intangible reassurance, grounding people in the middle of winter's chaos. And so, you sit there, letting the warmth seep into your bones, feeling both awe and comfort. This isn't luxury. It's strategy, ritual, and ingenuity wrapped into one glowing ember of life. You notice the subtle dances of light on rough beams, the way shadows stretch and retreat, and the faint smell of wood smoke that will linger long after the fire dies down. The hearth is the beating heart of the medieval home, and in understanding it, you start to grasp how people survived, adapted, and even found moments of joy amidst the cold. You step back from the hearth, letting the warmth linger on your skin as your gaze shifts to the walls around you. Thick timber beams dominate the structure, but between them, wattle and daub fill the gaps, a lattice of twigs plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. It might sound unappealing, but this combination actually provided decent insulation, keeping some of the biting cold at bay. Historians still argue whether these walls were truly effective against the harshest winters, or if they mostly offered psychological comfort. Either way, medieval households leaned on these walls as essential survival tools, layering ingenuity upon simplicity. You trace your fingers along the slightly uneven surface, feeling the rough texture of straw embedded in clay. Some families hung animal hides or thick woven tapestries against these walls, another quirky method to trap heat. You imagine the curious smell of tanned leather mingling with the clay and smoke, a pungent yet oddly homey aroma. Fringe accounts even suggest that some villagers sprinkled salt along the walls to prevent dampness, or hung herbs to sweeten the air, an unusual practice that may have been more about perception than actual humidity control. Peering upward, the roof structure also plays a role in insulation. Thick thatch layers, sometimes topped with mud or clay, act as both a shield against snow and a slow-release heat reservoir. It's fascinating to consider that these homes, despite their crude appearance, could remain tolerably warm compared to the frigid outdoors. Medieval carpenters were astute engineers, selecting timber not only for structural integrity, but also for its thermal properties. You notice the beam's subtle curve, perhaps a sign of careful crafting or years of bearing the weight of snow, but either way, they contribute to a surprisingly cozy environment inside. You glance at the corners of the room, where small gaps are often filled with rolled up straw or rushes. This improvisation isn't just insulation, it's an early form of draft proofing. Some families layered paper, cloth, or extra wooden panels to prevent icy gusts from slipping through. Historians still debate whether these measures genuinely reduced heat loss, or if they were more symbolic of household vigilance, an effort to assert control over a harsh environment. Either way, it's a testament to human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a touch of stubbornness. Moving closer to the walls, you notice tiny cracks that let in slivers of light and cold. Someone has patched a particularly large gap with a rough cloth, weighted down with stones, a simple solution, but effective. You chuckle at the thought of medieval DIY tutorials. Step 1, find a hide. Step 2, stuff it with straw. Step 3, pray it stays put until spring. Even so, these interventions speak volumes about the blend of creativity and necessity in daily life. You step back and examine a tapestry hanging on one wall. Beyond decoration, these textiles served as thermal buffers. Thick wool absorbs ambient warmth from the fire and prevents drafts, turning a bare timber wall into a more hospitable surface. Fringe sources suggest that some tapestries were deliberately embroidered with insulating patterns or even padded layers, though historians argue whether this was widespread or reserved for wealthier homes. Regardless, you can imagine villagers adjusting these fabrics seasonally, moving heavier weaves closer to sleeping areas as nights grew longer and colder. The floor beneath you also participates in insulation. Packed earth may seem unremarkable, but when layered with straw or rushes, it provides cushioning and retains residual heat from the hearth. You bend to touch a mat of rushes and inhale their earthy scent, noticing how the smell mixes with smoke and tanned hides. Some households even layered multiple mats to create thicker barriers against the cold, a simple, effective, and tactile reminder that warmth often came from layering materials and knowledge passed down through generations. Looking around the room, you spot small niches in the walls where everyday items are stored. These recesses double as insulation pockets, storing pots, textiles, or food. In these slightly warmer corners slows freezing and preserves resources. Fringe tales suggest that certain herbs or containers of water were strategically placed in wall cavities to influence indoor humidity, though historians still debate whether this was intentional climate control or anecdotal superstition. Either way, you recognize the consistent theme. Medieval people interacted with their homes actively, adjusting, patching, and layering in a continuous dialogue with the cold. You walk over to a particularly narrow window, covered with oiled parchment instead of glass. The translucent sheet softens daylight and reduces drafts while still allowing some light. Some families added wooden shutters for extra protection or hung textiles over the openings, a dual-purpose approach for light management and insulation. Historians argue whether these methods were sufficient to maintain warmth through the coldest nights, but when combined with layered walls, tapestries, and proximity to the hearth, they contributed to a surprisingly livable interior. Finally, you pause and take in the room as a whole. Every wall, floor, and ceiling component serves survival. Timber beams, wattle and daub hides, tapestries, rushes, and even herbs create a complex network of insulation that interacts dynamically with the hearth's heat. Fringe practices, whether practical or superstitious, further demonstrate humanity's drive to endure harsh conditions. You realize that medieval people weren't merely enduring winter, they were negotiating with it, improvising, observing, and constantly refining their domestic environment. The house itself becomes a living participant in survival, a layered, tactile, and fragrant cocoon that makes enduring months of bitter cold not just possible, but manageable. Your attention drifts from the walls to the soft, uneven bedding tucked into the corners of the room. Medieval beds were nothing like the plush mattresses we take for granted today. They were simple wooden frames, or even raised platforms covered with straw, rushes, or feathers if you were lucky. You probably wouldn't survive a night on one of these without layering up like an onion, but people made do, relying on thick wool blankets, furs, and a careful arrangement of bedding to conserve body heat. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had enough bedding to last the entire winter, or if they improvised. Nightly, with whatever materials were at hand, you kneel and touch the straw-stuffed mattress. It smells faintly of hay, and, if the family was particularly resourceful, herbs were tucked inside for fragrance and, according to folklore, to ward off sickness or even nightmares. Some fringe sources claim that placing sprigs of rosemary or lavender under your pillow kept frost spirits at bay, though modern scholars are skeptical about the efficacy. Still, you can imagine the comforting ritual of arranging herbs and blankets each evening. A small gesture that made the long, dark nights seem a little less forbidding. Layering is key. Woolen blankets over straw mats, additional furs for the coldest nights, and even extra clothing left on the bed for sleeping. Each layer traps body heat, preventing warmth from escaping into the icy air. You pull your own cloak tighter, imagining how this simple principle has endured through centuries. There's a practical rhythm, the heaviest coverings closest to the body, lighter ones on top, and always a buffer of dry material between you and the cold floor. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers even built small bed alcoves within walls, partially enclosed by tapestries or wooden panels, to create miniature microclimates that concentrated heat. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or reserved for wealthier homes, but the idea itself is fascinating. You notice the arrangement of pillows, or rather, stuffed sacks of wool, feathers, or dried herbs. Comfort was secondary to survival, yet it mattered. Sleeping positions were influenced by proximity to the hearth. The warmest spots were prime real estate. Families often huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in cramped spaces. In fact, the practice of body sharing was common in small houses, blending social bonding with practical survival. You probably wouldn't get away with that in modern times without a fire marshal calling, but in medieval winters, it was a necessity, and possibly the reason some survive long cold spells without suffering hypothermia. The bedding itself is a story of ingenuity. Rush-stuffed mattresses could be replenished annually, wool blankets were layered and mended tirelessly, and furs scavenged from hunting or trade were highly prized. Fringe records suggest that some families kept extra furs folded in wall niches, ready to rotate in and out as temperatures changed. Historians still argue whether these practices were standard among peasants or indicative of slightly wealthier households. But you can see how such strategies increased comfort and survival odds significantly. You lay your hands on a small, rough blanket, imagining a child curled underneath it, while the wind rattles, shudders, and snow pounds the roof. The warmth from shared bodies, hearth proximity, and layered bedding creates a microcosm of survival, a bubble within which the harsh world outside can be temporarily forgotten. Even small rituals, like shaking out the rushes or fluffing a wool pillow, became acts of maintenance that directly affected how well you could endure the cold night. The smell of the room is an odd mixture of straw, smoke, and wool, all carrying faint traces of previous night's sweat and cooking. Oddly enough, medieval families considered the slight earthiness comforting, a sign that life persisted despite frost and scarcity. Fringe beliefs even included placing a small pot of water near the bed to humidify the room, reducing the drying effect of fire and preventing respiratory discomfort. Historians debate whether this was widespread or just isolated anecdotes, but the principle reflects a sophisticated understanding of microclimate management. You imagine waking in the middle of the night, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and shuffling to rotate blankets or move closer to a small residual heat source. Survival was active, not passive. Every movement had a purpose. Some families even created small heating stones, warmed by the fire, to place under bedding. A quirky but effective way to extend warmth. You can't help but marvel at the resourcefulness. No electricity, no central heating, just careful observation, tradition, and a willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of life. Above all, the bedding and sleeping arrangements reveal the intimate relationship between people and their homes. Each layer, each stuffed sack, each shared blanket is part of a complex system designed to buffer the body against relentless cold. The combination of straw, wool, furs, and clever positioning turns a humble wooden room into a surprisingly resilient shelter. You pull an imaginary blanket over yourself, appreciating the ingenuity that turns basic materials into a life-saving defense against winter. Finally, as you sit back and imagine the family settled into their bed, the room glowing softly from the dying fire, you notice the delicate balance of comfort and survival. Every element, the layering, the herbs, the shared heat, is a testament to human adaptation. You realize that these simple, sometimes odd practices allowed people not only to endure winter, but to thrive within it, creating warmth, security, and a rhythm of life that repeated year after year. In this small wooden house, survival isn't passive. It's an art, a ritual, and an intimate negotiation with the cold itself. Your eyes drift to the clothing draped across hooks and benches, reminding you that surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about blankets or walls, it was also about what you wore. Layers were essential. Tunics over linen shirts, woolen cloaks, and if you were lucky, fur-lined garments made the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to frostbite. You probably wouldn't survive more than a few nights without thinking carefully about layering, because unlike modern central heating, your body was your primary heater. Historians still argue whether peasants could afford real fur for warmth, or if most relied solely on wool, patched repeatedly and layered generously. You pick up a rough wool tunic and hold it against your cheek. The texture is coarse, but effective at trapping heat. Some fringe sources suggest that villagers would wear several thin layers rather than a single thick one, believing that multiple barriers created a buffer that insulated better than any single garment. You'll probably laugh at the idea today, but the principle is sound. Multiple thin layers trap pockets of warm air and allow for flexibility, whether you're chopping wood, tending animals, or huddling by the fire. Cloaks were another essential piece, draped over shoulders and fastened with wooden or metal pins. They weren't just about warmth. They could serve as makeshift blankets at night, or shields against icy winds when venturing outside. You notice the variety in color, texture, and weight. Fringe accounts even suggest that some families lined cloaks with furs scavenged from hunts or trades, creating portable warmth that could be rotated or shared. Historians still debate whether the average peasant possessed such garments or if they were reserved for wealthier households, but the layering principle applied universally. Footwear plays a surprisingly important role. Thick leather boots, often lined with wool or stuffed with straw, protected toes from frostbite. Some sources mention small internal insoles of fur or moss to trap heat. You probably wouldn't survive a trek across snow-packed fields without insulating your feet, and medieval ingenuity rose to the occasion. Fringe texts even suggest that villagers sometimes wore multiple layers of socks, swapping damp ones for dry pairs during the day, a primitive, yet effective, form of thermal management. You glance at the head coverings, essential for preventing heat loss from the crown of the head. Coifs, hoods, and caps, made of wool, fur, or layered cloth, were common. Some fringe practices suggest placing herbs inside head coverings to ward off cold-related illnesses, a curious mix of superstition and practical insulation. Scholars still debate whether such rituals were widespread or symbolic gestures, but there's no denying that covering the head made a tangible difference in maintaining body warmth. Hands and arms weren't neglected. Leather or wool gloves and mittens, sometimes layered, protected extremities that would otherwise succumb quickly to frost. You imagine children in particularly cold villages, their small fingers wrapped in scraps of cloth, hands tucked under the armpits for extra warmth. The combination of care, improvisation, and practicality. Even simple gestures, like wrapping a cloak tighter around the shoulders or tucking sleeves into gloves, mattered immensely for survival. You notice the strategic placement of clothing inside the house. Extra tunics and cloaks are often near the hearth, warming passively and ready for use. Some families even hung garments on hooks above the fire, allowing them to dry and warm simultaneously, a practical multitasking solution. Historians still argue whether this method was effective in the long term or merely a temporary convenience, but it underscores a key point. Every movement and arrangement in medieval homes was influenced by the need to retain warmth. Oddly, some fringe accounts suggest that villagers believed certain colors or fabrics could influence personal warmth. Dark wool was thought to absorb more heat from limited sunlight, and tightly woven textiles supposedly trapped body heat better than loose knits. Whether true or not, these beliefs demonstrate how medieval people observed, experimented, and mythologized survival strategies, blending empirical knowledge with folklore. You imagine the daily routine, donning multiple layers before stepping outside, adjusting clothing based on temperature, and continually rotating damp or frozen garments. Survival required attention to detail, foresight, and constant adaptation. Even sitting near the fire, people adjusted layers to prevent overheating while maintaining core warmth. Your modern convenience of a thermostat might make this seem tedious, but the medieval approach was both practical and sophisticated. Finally, you run your hands along the rough fabrics, appreciating the tactile ingenuity. Wool, fur, linen, and leather weren't just clothing, they were mobile insulation, integral to daily life and survival. Each layer, each material, and each arrangement was a deliberate choice shaped by necessity, observation, and experience. You realize that medieval winter survival relied as much on knowledge, experimentation, and preparation as it did on any single material or tool. Clothing was not fashion, it was survival, artfully applied and meticulously maintained to shield the body against relentless cold. Your gaze drifts toward the kitchen area, where the smell of smoke mingles with dried herbs and the faint tang of preserved foods. Winter survival wasn't just about warmth, it was also about sustenance. Fresh produce was scarce, so medieval households relied heavily on dried, salted, smoked, and fermented foods to get through the long months. You probably wouldn't survive on just a handful of root vegetables without some clever preservation techniques. Historians still argue whether most peasants had reliable access to preserved foods, or if scarcity often forced improvisation. You bend over a clay jar, noting the carefully packed dried beans and lentils inside. Legumes were essential, high in protein, easy to store, and versatile in cooking. Some fringe accounts suggest that families even buried jars of vegetables in the cold ground outside, to keep them from spoiling, a primitive form of refrigeration. It might sound quirky, but it reflects the ingenuity of people who had to stretch resources across months of frost. You imagine the anxiety of opening a jar, hoping nothing had gone moldy. Every meal, a small gamble against starvation. Salted and smoked meats hang from the ceiling beams, swaying gently with the house's settling. Ham, bacon, and small game preserved in this way could last weeks or months. You notice how the smoke from the hearth not only warms the room, but also contributes subtly to meat preservation. A fortuitous overlap of needs. Fringe tales even suggest that some villagers added herbs or pine needles to meat storage areas, believing it both flavored and prolonged the life of the food. Practice historians still debate as either widespread or mostly anecdotal. Fermented foods like sauerkraut or pickled vegetables also played a critical role. The tangy flavor wasn't just culinary, it was nutritional, providing necessary vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases. You can almost taste the sour bite, a testament to how survival often came wrapped in flavor as much as function. Some families even maintained small clay vessels of fermented dairy or grains, providing variety in calories during the monotonous winter months. You probably wouldn't find this in a modern kitchen without a dedicated fermentation enthusiast. But back then, it was a lifeline. You reach for a small bundle of onions hanging near the hearth. Quirky folklore suggests that eating onions or garlic could stave off colds, and some households relied on this belief religiously. Whether effective or not, the psychological comfort of these rituals mattered as much as nutrition itself. Historians still debate the extent to which these practices influenced actual health outcomes versus merely providing a sense of control during harsh winters. Preserving grains was another meticulous task. Barley, oats, and rye were stored in sacks or clay pots, often elevated to protect against moisture and rodents. Some fringe sources mention small stones or clay tablets placed inside grain containers to absorb dampness, a curious but logical method to prevent spoilage. You can picture families carefully checking their stores, rotating grains, and ensuring every handful was accounted for. A constant negotiation with scarcity and spoilage. You notice a small heap of dried fruits, apples, pears, maybe some plums. These were prized delicacies, providing sugar, flavor, and energy when other fresh foods were unavailable. Some households even infused fruits with honey or wine to extend shelf life, though this was more common among wealthier villagers. Fringe accounts claim that occasionally families used fruit skins as part of winter stews, stretching limited supplies while adding flavor, a small act of culinary ingenuity born from necessity. Legumes, grains, and preserved foods are arranged carefully near the hearth, benefiting from residual warmth. You can almost see medieval parents teaching children the subtle art of rationing. Measure carefully, save some for tomorrow, and don't waste even a crumb. This isn't just nutrition, it's education, culture, and survival, all wrapped into one. The smell of simmering porridge, occasionally stirred with a wooden spoon, brings a small but constant sense of comfort to an otherwise cold home. You step back and take in the entire food ecosystem of the room. Jars of legumes, hanging meats, baskets of roots, and clay vessels of fermented foods. Every choice, from preservation method to storage location, reflects a delicate balance between available resources, nutritional needs, and environmental conditions. Fringe practices, superstitions, and rituals add another layer of human ingenuity, creating a tapestry of survival strategies that seem both practical and charmingly odd. Finally, as you sit near the fire and nibble on imagined dried beans or a piece of salted meat, you realize how food preservation transforms a simple wooden house into a lifeline. It isn't glamorous, and it requires constant attention, but it allows people to endure the long winter months, providing both energy and reassurance. In combination with fire, insulation, bedding, and clothing, these preserved foods complete a sophisticated network of survival, a system honed over generations to meet the relentless demands of medieval winters. You shift your gaze from the preserved foods to the people inhabiting this wooden house, realizing that surviving winter was as much a social endeavor as a physical one. Space was limited, and everyone clustered near the hearth for warmth. Shared proximity wasn't just convenience, it was necessity. You probably wouldn't survive a deep freeze without close body heat from family or neighbors. Historians still argue whether the average household preferred communal sleeping arrangements purely for warmth or also for social cohesion, but the practical overlap is undeniable. Children huddle near their parents, their small bodies absorbing heat while learning the rhythms of survival. Some fringe accounts suggest that older siblings would rotate sleeping positions with younger ones, a primitive but effective way to distribute warmth evenly. You can almost hear soft whispers and muffled giggles as the family adjusts layers of blankets and furs, sharing the hottest spots while the outer edges remain chillier. It's a delicate choreography of comfort, negotiation, and instinctual survival. Even meals were communal events. Everyone ate near the fire, sharing not just food, but warmth. The steam rising from a simmering pot created a small ambient heat, softening the chill in the corners of the room. Fringe practices included having children hold small ceramic vessels of hot broth on their laps to warm hands and laps, simultaneously a quirky, efficient tactic that shows just how creative people were in maximizing limited resources. Scholars still debate whether such practices were standard or occasional improvisations, but the principle is consistent. Survival thrived on cooperation. You notice the sleeping arrangements along one wall, close to the fire, where adults and children lay on layered straw mats and furs. Some families practiced body sharing during especially cold nights, deliberately clustering to conserve heat. The modern mind might balk at the lack of personal space, but in a wooden house with no insulation beyond timber, textiles, and shared warmth, proximity equaled survival. Fringe stories suggest that occasionally, Even neighbors would join in this shared warmth during storms, reinforcing social bonds while keeping frostbite at bay. Communal tasks extended beyond sleep and meals. Chopping firewood, tending the hearth, and even repairing walls were shared responsibilities. You watch someone rotate logs in the hearth, feeling the heat radiate, while another prepares a simple stew. The choreography is seamless. Everyone has a role, and each role contributes directly to survival. Historians still argue whether such communal labor was formalized in traditions or emerged organically, but the result is a household functioning as a single organism against winter's assault. Clothing. Storage also reflects social ingenuity. Spare cloaks, tunics, and blankets were often rotated among family members to ensure everyone had dry, warm garments. You imagine an older sibling handing a slightly damp woolen layer to a younger child, replacing it with a dry one, silently balancing comfort and survival. Fringe accounts even suggest that some families used small wooden boxes near the hearth to pre-warm garments overnight. Simple hack that maximized efficiency and minimized discomfort. Even pets played a role in communal warmth. Cats and dogs often slept alongside family members, adding their body heat to the shared pool. Some fringe tales suggest that livestock, like small goats or lambs, were occasionally brought inside during severe storms. Their presence not just for warmth but also for companionship and morale. Scholars still debate whether bringing animals indoors was widespread or risky, but the intermingling of human and animal warmth underscores the holistic approach to surviving cold winters. You notice the gentle bustle in the background. Someone sweeps the floor. Another stirs a pot. Children whisper quietly. A dog shifts its weight near the fire. The social network of survival is constant, subtle, and deeply interwoven with the physical space. Sharing proximity, coordinating tasks, and pooling resources allowed people to endure months that would otherwise be deadly. Fringe rituals, like telling stories or humming near the hearth, may seem trivial, but they reinforced cohesion, reduced stress, and indirectly conserved energy by keeping everyone calm and cooperative. By evening, the household forms a living circle around the hearth, bodies pressed into blankets and furs, sharing warmth, light, and human contact. You feel the ebb and flow of heat, the rhythm of life adapted to cold, and the unspoken choreography that balances comfort and survival. Even with walls, fire, and food, it's the social structure's proximity, shared labor, collective vigilance that make enduring winter possible. You lean back, imagining yourself among them, feeling both humbled and reassured by the delicate, warm ecosystem human ingenuity has created in this small wooden house. Finally, the communal aspect reminds you that medieval survival wasn't solitary. Endurance depended on observation, adaptation, and cooperation, blending warmth, nourishment, and social bonds into a living network of resilience. Without these social strategies, firewalls, bedding, and clothing might not be enough. Together, they formed a tapestry of survival, rich in ingenuity, ritual, and shared human experience. Your eyes wander to the windows and doors, the unsung heroes of winter survival in a medieval wooden house. Unlike modern double-glazed panes, these openings were simple, often covered with oiled parchment, thin cloth, or wooden shutters. The goal wasn't elegance, it was survival. You probably wouldn't survive without a careful strategy to block icy drafts. Historians still argue whether these methods significantly improved interior warmth, or served more to shield families from wind and snow than to retain heat. You step closer to the window, feeling the chill seeping through gaps. Some households hung tapestries or thick blankets over openings, a quirky yet practical method to trap heat. Fringe accounts suggest that layering textiles over windows wasn't merely insulation, it was believed to capture the warmth spirit of the hearth, an odd fusion of superstition and practicality. Even if the belief seems strange, the effect was tangible. Reduced drafts, slightly warmer interiors, and a psychological boost that winter was manageable. The door is another critical point. Often a single thick plank with wooden latch, it was reinforced with rope, extra boards, or even hides to prevent icy gusts from sweeping in. You probably wouldn't survive a gale ripping through your house without some clever blockade. Fringe tales claim that placing a small pot of water at the threshold could prevent frost from creeping inside, a curious and somewhat mysterious practice historians still debate whether effective or symbolic. It illustrates the constant attention people paid to controlling cold entry points. You notice small gaps between beams and the floor or roof. Many families stuffed these with moss, straw, or rags. This improvisation might seem humble, but it was surprisingly effective. Drafts could sap warmth in minutes, and even a few inches of extra insulation around critical openings mattered. Fringe sources mention the odd practice of hanging charms or inscriptions above doors and windows, thought to seal in warmth. Historians question whether these rituals had widespread adoption, yet they underscore humanity's instinct to blend belief with practical measures. Oiled parchment windows, a staple in many homes, diffuse weak sunlight while still providing a barrier against wind. The parchment is translucent, allowing enough daylight to illuminate interiors while minimizing heat loss. Some households doubled layers of parchment or added shutters for extra protection during storms. You can almost see the subtle glow in the room as sunlight filters through, softening shadows, warming walls, and giving a sense of temporal rhythm, another layer of comfort amid winter monotony. Door coverings were equally adaptable. Hides, cloths, and even thick rush mats could be draped or temporarily repositioned, depending on wind direction. Fringe accounts suggest that medieval families sometimes changed coverings daily, based on temperature, snowfall, or superstition about cold spirits. Historians still argue whether such meticulous adjustments were practical, symbolic, or both. But the underlying principle is clear. Survival relied on continuous attention to the movement of cold air. You notice how the placement of furniture also influences drafts. Benches, chests, and tables weren't just for sitting or storage. They were strategically positioned to block airflow. Some fringe sources claim that families would place clay pots filled with hot water near windows or doors, a rudimentary form of localized heating. While historians debate the prevalence of this practice, the concept illustrates an adaptive mindset. Every object had multiple purposes in mitigating winter's harshness. Even small holes for ventilation were carefully managed. Smoke from the hearth needed escape, but uncontrolled drafts could chill the house. Families adjusted flaps, ropes, or shutters to balance airflow, ensuring that smoke cleared without losing too much heat. Fringe practices include inserting small bundles of herbs in these vents, supposedly to purify the air while maintaining warmth. Modern scholars remain divided on whether these methods genuinely altered room temperature, but they showcase the ingenuity and observation-driven strategies of medieval households. You step back, taking in the interplay of windows, doors, shutters, tapestries, and furniture. It's a living system, constantly adjusted to retain heat while accommodating light, ventilation, and daily activity. Fringe rituals, while odd, reinforce the human need for control and reassurance amid uncertainty. You realize that surviving winter in a wooden house wasn't merely about fire or walls. It was an ongoing, dynamic negotiation with the environment, requiring constant vigilance and small, deliberate interventions. Finally, you imagine a storm raging outside, snow piling against shutters, wind whistling through gaps, and the family inside adjusting doors, draping tapestries, and managing smoke from the hearth. It's a delicate balance, a choreography of observation, superstition, and practical ingenuity. Through careful management of openings, medieval households could create surprisingly resilient interiors. proving that survival is as much about controlling what comes in as what stays within. Your eyes sweep the room again, and you realize that light, or the lack of it, plays a surprisingly critical role in winter survival. Sunlight streaming through oiled parchment or small gaps can offer fleeting warmth, even if faint, and provide a psychological boost during the long dark months. You probably wouldn't survive the monotony of winter without these small rays of natural light, yet they were secondary to the constant battle against cold. Historians still argue whether medieval families actively oriented homes for maximum winter sunlight, or if building practices were mostly determined by land, materials, and tradition inside the house. Every reflective surface, polished wood, metal utensils, or even clay pots helps bounce available light around the room. Fringe accounts suggest that some households strategically positioned shiny vessels near the hearth to amplify light and heat, a subtle, almost magical tactic. Whether this was widespread or experimental, it illustrates a mindset of observation and resourcefulness. You can almost see the flicker of reflected firelight dancing across walls, brightening dark corners and giving a comforting sense of activity and life. Candles and rushlights supplement natural light, but they serve a dual purpose: illumination and warmth. A single flickering flame might seem minor, yet in a tightly packed wooden room, even modest radiant heat is noticeable. You probably wouldn't survive without careful placement of these small fires, which illuminate tasks while contributing incrementally to overall warmth. Fringe practices include inserting small pots of water near flames to humidify dry air, reducing winter discomfort, a clever, low-tech solution that modern readers might find charmingly primitive. You glance at the small niches carved into walls, and the shelves where tools, cooking implements, and even religious icons rest. These objects do more than store belongings. They subtly influence microclimates. For instance, densely packed jars and vessels absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, a passive form of thermal regulation. Some fringe accounts claim that placing sacred figurines near the hearth could invite warmth, blending superstition with environmental adaptation. Scholars still debate the prevalence of such beliefs, but the effect, whether psychological or practical, was real. Air circulation is another subtle component of survival. Too stagnant, and smoke or dampness accumulates. Too drafty, and precious heat escapes. Families adjusted shutters, vents, and furniture placement constantly, balancing warmth, light, and breathable air. You probably wouldn't survive a smoky, poorly ventilated room without some trial-and-error observation, which medieval households had in abundance. Fringe practices like hanging bundles of herbs in corners or near smoke vents may have provided aromatic comfort, though historians argue over whether this truly influenced air quality or was mostly ritualistic. You notice the cyclical routines designed around both light and warmth. Morning chores coincide with daylight to maximize visibility while minimizing reliance on fire. Tasks requiring precision, mending clothes, preparing meals, cleaning, are done near light sources. With the dual benefit of warmth, some households even shifted furniture seasonally to make the most of sunlight, moving sleeping areas or workspaces closer to sunlit walls. Historians still debate how deliberate these strategies were versus simple adaptation, but the principle demonstrates careful observation and planning. Children's roles in this ecosystem are surprisingly vital. They fetch small bundles of kindling, maintain the hearth's embers, or assist in moving furniture to block drafts. Their proximity to light and warmth teaches them survival skills intuitively, blending education with daily necessity. Fringe accounts even suggest playful games around the fire could maintain morale while keeping bodies warm, an ingenious fusion of entertainment and endurance. You probably wouldn't think of survival as social play, yet here it intertwines seamlessly. You step back and imagine the delicate equilibrium: sunlight filtering through windows, firelight reflecting off pots, warm surfaces radiating gentle heat, and people moving carefully to maintain this balance. Every adjustment, whether spiritual, practical, or superstitious, contributes to sustaining life during relentless winter nights. The house itself feels alive, a responsive system shaped by observation, adaptation, and human ingenuity. Finally, as night deepens and shadows stretch across walls, you sense how intertwined light, warmth, and human activity are in medieval winter survival. Even with thick walls, layered clothing, and a roaring hearth, it's the management of small environmental factors, light air, heat, and psychological comfort that ensures the household endures. Survival is a mosaic of careful attention, ritual, and clever adaptation, a testament to human resilience in the face of seasonal adversity. Your attention drifts from the walls to the soft, uneven bedding tucked into the corners of the room. Medieval beds were nothing like the plush mattresses we take for granted today. They were simple wooden frames, or even raised platforms covered with straw, rushes, or feathers if you were lucky. You probably wouldn't survive a night on one of these without layering up like an onion, but people made do, relying on thick wool blankets, furs, and a careful arrangement of bedding to conserve body heat. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had enough bedding to last the entire winter, or if they improvised. Nightly, with whatever materials were at hand, you kneel and touch the straw-stuffed mattress. It smells faintly of hay, and, if the family was particularly resourceful, herbs were tucked inside for fragrance and, according to folklore, to ward off sickness or even nightmares. Some fringe sources claim that placing sprigs of rosemary or lavender under your pillow kept frost spirits at bay, though modern scholars are skeptical about the efficacy. Still, you can imagine the comforting ritual of arranging herbs and blankets each evening. A small gesture that made the long, dark nights seem a little less forbidding. Layering is key. Woolen blankets over straw mats, additional furs for the coldest nights, and even extra clothing left on the bed for sleeping. Each layer traps body heat, preventing warmth from escaping into the icy air. You pull your own cloak tighter, imagining how this simple principle has endured through centuries. There's a practical rhythm, the heaviest coverings closest to the body, lighter ones on top, and always a buffer of dry material between you and the cold floor. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers even built small bed alcoves within walls, partially enclosed by tapestries or wooden panels, to create miniature microclimates that concentrated heat. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or reserved for wealthier homes, but the idea itself is fascinating. You notice the arrangement of pillows, or rather, stuffed sacks of wool, feathers, or dried herbs. Comfort was secondary to survival, yet it mattered. Sleeping positions were influenced by proximity to the hearth. The warmest spots were prime real estate. Families often huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in cramped spaces. In fact, the practice of body sharing was common in small houses, blending social bonding with practical survival. You probably wouldn't get away with that in modern times without a fire marshal calling, but in medieval winters, it was a necessity, and possibly the reason some survive long cold spells without suffering hypothermia. The bedding itself is a story of ingenuity. Rush-stuffed mattresses could be replenished annually, wool blankets were layered and mended tirelessly, and furs scavenged from hunting or trade were highly prized. Fringe records suggest that some families kept extra furs folded in wall niches, ready to rotate in and out as temperatures changed. Historians still argue whether these practices were standard among peasants or indicative of slightly wealthier households. But you can see how such strategies increased comfort and survival odds significantly. You lay your hands on a small, rough blanket, imagining a child curled underneath it, while the wind rattles, shudders, and snow pounds the roof. The warmth from shared bodies, hearth proximity, and layered bedding creates a microcosm of survival. a bubble within which the harsh world outside can be temporarily forgotten. Even small rituals, like shaking out the rushes or fluffing a wool pillow, became acts of maintenance that directly affected how well you could endure the cold night. The smell of the room is an odd mixture of straw, smoke, and wool, all carrying faint traces of previous night's sweat and cooking. Oddly enough, medieval families considered the slight earthiness comforting, a sign that life persisted despite frost and scarcity. Fringe beliefs even included placing a small pot of water near the bed to humidify the room, reducing the drying effect of fire and preventing respiratory discomfort. Historians debate whether this was widespread or just isolated anecdotes, but the principle reflects a sophisticated understanding of microclimate management. You imagine waking in the middle of the night, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and shuffling to rotate blankets or move closer to a small residual heat source. Survival was active, not passive. Every movement had a purpose. Some families even created small heating stones, warmed by the fire, to place under bedding. A quirky but effective way to extend warmth. You can't help but marvel at the resourcefulness. No electricity, no central heating, just careful observation, tradition, and a willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of life. Above all, the bedding and sleeping arrangements reveal the intimate relationship between people and their homes. Each layer, each stuffed sack, each shared blanket is part of a complex system designed to buffer the body against relentless cold. The combination of straw, wool, furs, and clever positioning turns a humble wooden room into a surprisingly resilient shelter. You pull an imaginary blanket over yourself, appreciating the ingenuity that turns basic materials into a life-saving defense against winter. Finally, as you sit back and imagine the family settled into their bed, the room glowing softly from the dying fire, you notice the delicate balance of comfort and survival. Every element, the layering, the herbs, the shared heat, is a testament to human adaptation. You realize that these simple, sometimes odd practices allowed people not only to endure winter, but to thrive within it, creating warmth, security, and a rhythm of life that repeated year after year. In this small wooden house, survival isn't passive. It's an art, a ritual, and an intimate negotiation with the cold itself. Your eyes drift to the clothing draped across hooks and benches, reminding you that surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about blankets or walls, it was also about what you wore. Layers were essential. Tunics over linen shirts, woolen cloaks, and if you were lucky, fur-lined garments made the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to frostbite. You probably wouldn't survive more than a few nights without thinking carefully about layering, because unlike modern central heating, your body was your primary heater. Historians still argue whether peasants could afford real fur for warmth, or if most relied solely on wool, patched repeatedly and layered generously. You pick up a rough wool tunic and hold it against your cheek. The texture is coarse, but effective at trapping heat. Some fringe sources suggest that villagers would wear several thin layers, rather than a single thick one, believing that multiple barriers created a buffer that insulated better than any single garment. You'll probably laugh at the idea today, but the principle is sound. Multiple thin layers trap pockets of warm air and allow for flexibility, whether you're chopping wood, tending animals, or huddling by the fire. Cloaks were another essential piece, draped over shoulders and fastened with wooden or metal pins. They weren't just about warmth. They could serve as makeshift blankets at night, or shields against icy winds when venturing outside. You notice the variety in color, texture, and weight. Fringe accounts even suggest that some families lined cloaks with furs scavenged from hunts or trades, creating portable warmth that could be rotated or shared. Historians still debate whether the average peasant possessed such garments or if they were reserved for wealthier households, but the layering principle applied universally. Footwear plays a surprisingly important role. Thick leather boots, often lined with wool or stuffed with straw, protected toes from frostbite. Some sources mention small internal insoles of fur or moss to trap heat. You probably wouldn't survive a trek across snow-packed fields without insulating your feet. And medieval ingenuity rose to the occasion. Fringe texts even suggest that villagers sometimes wore multiple layers of socks, swapping damp ones for dry pairs during the day. A primitive, yet effective, form of thermal management. You glance at the head coverings, essential for preventing heat loss from the crown of the head. Coifs, hoods, and caps made of wool, fur, or layered cloth were common. Some fringe practices suggest placing herbs inside head coverings to ward off cold-related illnesses, a curious mix of superstition and practical insulation. Scholars still debate whether such rituals were widespread or symbolic gestures, but there's no denying that covering the head made a tangible difference in maintaining body warmth. Hands and arms weren't neglected. Leather or wool gloves and mittens, sometimes layered, protected extremities that would otherwise succumb quickly to frost. You imagine children in particularly cold villages, their small fingers wrapped in scraps of cloth, hands tucked under the armpits for extra warmth. The final piece of winter survival in a medieval wooden house is vigilance. The quiet, continuous attention that threads through every aspect of daily life. You'll notice how everything from fire management to clothing placement, from food storage to ventilation is monitored almost constantly. You probably wouldn't survive long in a cold snap without this diligence, because the enemy isn't just the cold, it's complacency. Historians still argue whether such vigilance was instinctive, learned through family tradition, or enforced by social norms, but either way, it's unmistakable in the design and routines of the home. You move around the room, observing small adjustments. A log rotated in the hearth, a tapestry repositioned over a drafty window, a pot of water nudged closer to the fire. Fringe accounts suggest that some households even assigned night watchers to ensure embers didn't die completely, and that sleeping children remained adequately warm. It seems almost theatrical today, but in the medieval winter, such routines were a blend of necessity and ritual. Every action matters because even minor heat loss can accumulate into real danger. The family's rhythm revolves around these tasks. You notice how each member participates, from children stoking embers to adults repairing walls or bedding. There's a quiet choreography. The hearth crackles, smoke drifts toward the roof vents, and bodies rotate near the fire to maintain core warmth. Fringe practices, like singing softly to soothe children or murmuring protective charms while arranging blankets, may seem quaint, but they contribute to morale and a sense of control over the harsh environment. Scholars still debate how widespread these rituals were, but their presence in historical accounts underscores the fusion of practicality and culture. Water management is another subtle element of vigilance. Frozen water can jeopardize cooking, drinking, and hygiene. You watch as small quantities are thawed near the hearth, while pots and vessels are rotated to retain heat. Fringe sources mention people sometimes storing water in underground pits or insulated wooden boxes to prevent freezing. A clever, low-tech solution to a persistent problem. Historians still debate whether this was common among peasants or limited to wealthier households, but it reflects an adaptive mindset. Anticipate scarcity, mitigate risk, and maintain functionality. You turn to food storage, noting how jars, baskets, and shelves are arranged for both access and insulation. Regular checks ensure nothing spoils, and meals are rationed to maximize calories and minimize waste. Some fringe accounts even describe families testing dried goods with small amounts of heat to check for dampness or mold before preparing them, a ritual that combines care with survival strategy. Historians still argue whether such meticulous habits were widespread, but their existence demonstrates an acute awareness of winter's hazards. Clothing and bedding, too, require continuous attention. Layers are adjusted with temperature changes, damp garments dried near the hearth, and furs rotated to ensure everyone benefits from shared warmth. You imagine a child waking in the night, tugged back under layers, while an adult quietly stokes embers to maintain the room's microclimate. Fringe tales mention families occasionally rearranging rushes or straw under sleeping areas to trap residual heat, a tactile and improvisational approach to comfort. Even psychological vigilance matters. Storytelling, quiet conversation, and small household rituals keep spirits high. You watch as laughter softly punctuates the night, mixing with the hearth's crackle. Historians still debate whether such rituals had tangible effects on survival or were more about cultural cohesion. Yet they clearly fostered resilience, turning the cold and dark into something bearable, even communal. By the late evening, the house feels like a living organism. Walls, hearth, windows, furniture, bedding, clothing, food, and people interact in an ongoing network of vigilance. Every decision when to stoke the fire, where to move a blanket, how to position a jar of beans is informed by observation, experience, and anticipation. Fringe practices, quirky yet practical, add layers of both insulation and morale. You probably wouldn't survive a severe winter without this constant, nuanced attention. But within these routines, life continues. Finally, you sit near the hearth and take a deep breath, feeling the accumulated warmth of layered walls, clothing, bedding, food, and shared bodies. Survival is not passive, it is deliberate, meticulous, and continuous. Every ember fed, every draft blocked, every layer adjusted is part of a living system designed to withstand months of frost, wind, and snow. In this small wooden house, the medieval household demonstrates human ingenuity at its finest. Adaptation, observation, cooperation, and ritual combined into a network that transforms a cold, harsh world into a livable, resilient home. Now, as the fire settles into glowing embers, the room softens, shadows stretching long across timber walls. You can feel the tension of survival easing, the meticulous vigilance of the day giving way to gentle rhythm. Breath fogs in the cool air, but the warmth of layered blankets, furs, and shared bodies is steady, comforting, a pulse you can sink into. The scent of smoke lingers faintly, earthy and reassuring, blending with herbs tucked into bedding and dried food that will sustain you. Through the night, you notice how light softens through oiled parchment windows, pale and muted, touching corners where blankets and straw absorb the last of the day's heat. The fire crackles one final time before settling, a gentle, sporadic whisper that seems almost like a lullaby. Outside, wind scours rooftops and rattles shutters, but inside, there is quiet. The warmth, the rituals, the layered fabrics, the shared presence all form a cocoon against the relentless cold. In this stillness, you can almost hear centuries of whispered stories carried in the rhythm of survival. Families adjusting blankets, stoking embers, murmuring charms, tending stores of food and water, sharing heat and laughter. Life continues not just through material preparation, but through quiet, patient attention, the weaving of routines and care into an enduring fabric of safety. Even quirky rituals, herbs, and subtle adjustments contribute to a sense of mastery over environment. However small or symbolic, your body relaxes. Senses tuned to gentle sounds, a distant crackle of wood, the sigh of timber, the soft rustle of furs. Every layer of warmth, clothing, bedding, firelight, human proximity melds into a comforting whole. The cold outside is formidable, but here, inside this wooden house, life continues with quiet ingenuity and shared presence. You feel both reassured and humbled by the layered strategies of survival, a legacy of adaptation and resilience. Down, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your mind drift gently. Imagine the warmth, the gentle glow, the rhythm of life in a medieval house enduring winter. You are safe, cocooned, carried forward on centuries of human resourcefulness, and care. Sleep begins to ease in, soft as snow settling on a quiet roof.